in the history of the human race what's going on in China. This is a society that has moved in a matter of 2 or 3 decades, hundreds of millions of people off of agriculture into industry in the cities. That same process for the same number of people took centuries in Europe. And we're talking decades in China. It's just, and those people have to have work. They cannot go back to the rural. They have to have jobs or else that society implodes. So for them, this is not just a question of making money. This is a question of social stability, which their leaders say over and over again. So what they want is a safe, predictable, controlled world of currencies where everybody knows what everything is worth. They really want to go back to what was done after World War II at Bretton Woods, a system of what was called fixed exchange rates. For those of you that don't remember, exchange rates were set in 1946, and they stayed that way until the United States ended that in 1971. Richard Nixon went on television August 15, 1971, and said, up until now, we've had a fixed relationship. Everybody knew every year what the price of a pound was relative to a dollar. And everybody knew what the price of gold was. For all those years, $42 an ounce. On August 15th, Nixon gets on the radio and announces to the world, we have always honored the contract. You bring us $42, we'll give you an ounce of gold. However, we've been losing our gold from Fort Knox at quite a clip. So as of tomorrow morning, if you bring us $1, we will smile at you and point you towards the door. No more gold. We went off the gold standard. That's what that means. And because we were having a big inflation at that time, and the president stopped the inflation. Just a footnote for those of you that I can tell from your faces. How did we stop an inflation? In the best old-fashioned way. President Nixon, a conservative Republican, don't you know? August 15, 71, gets on TV. We go off the gold standards. That's basically, in a sort of polite way, saying to the world, or not saying anything, showing the world the middle finger of your hand. We're not going to do it anymore, and you can go jump in a lake. And then to control the inflation, he announced, as of tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock, that is the 16th of August, anyone who raises a price of anything will go to jail. That's what he did. That's what he said. He declared what's called a wage price freeze. If you're a businessman and you raise the price from now on, you're going to jail. You will have committed a crime. Business, I want to be sure, all businesses who believe that a private enterprise system hallows the freedom of the enterprise to decide what to charge, were told by a conservative Republican, you exercise that freedom from now on, you'll be looking at the wrong side of bars. He told every union in America, if you raise wages, if you do anything to raise wages, you're going to jail. Guess what? The inflation came to a screeching halt. End of inflation. When anyone tells you, gee, we can't, what are we going to do with inflation? What's the problem? That was a political decision. That was made because it was clear to the people who run this society that the United States was in a very difficult place and it had to take clear, hard action. And it wasn't going to allow the private decisions of corporations to screw this up. And it was very important to have a Republican conservative tell the business community that one of their cherished freedoms had just been taken away. And guess what the business community did? Nothing.
How long did it last?
6 months. Very hard to enforce. Very hard to enforce, and it means that if you're really going to enforce it, it means you have to have government inspectors start going in and looking at everybody's books, and that freaks all private enterprises out, since if you know how every enterprise in America works, it always has 2 sets of books, one for the government tax people, and one so it knows what it's actually doing, and you don't want the government to get into the wrong set of books, etc., etc., etc. Now your second question. We did not become a credit-dependent society until the 20th century. For most of the history of the United States, the rising level of consumption of American workers was paid for by a rising real wage. That is, the money wages they got rose faster than the prices they had to pay. And consequently, the dependence on credit for consumers and workers is really a modern phenomenon. It begins in the Great Depression on a mass scale. And because it was a policy of the government of Roosevelt, one of the ways to get us out of the Great Depression was to stimulate a new industry. And here was the industry that was stimulated: the private individual house. It's very important you understand. Before the Great Depression, the majority of Americans were either farmers living in a house on a farm, or they lived in a tenement in a city. There were no suburbs. Suburb is a post-World War II invention. And here's what made the suburb possible. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, when there was so much unemployment, and remember, we have an unemployment now roughly 10% official. The equivalent unemployment rate in 1933 was 25%, 2.5 times what it is now. So much more urgent to do something in a society that collapsed. Okay? So here's what Roosevelt came up with. We could put millions of people to work if we could suddenly create a demand for something that's labor intensive. Ah, I know what it is, his advisors said to him. Americans would love to have their own homes. The vast majority now live in these awful tenements, in the tenement, you know, on the Lower East Side here in New York. They have a wonderful thing down there that takes you on a tour about those tenements, but it's quite an education to see how those people live, crowded and all that. Americans want a home that isn't a tenement. But of course, they don't have the money. And they can't go to the bank because the bank takes one look at them and says, I'm not lending you any money because you're a deadbeat. It's too risky to lend you money. So in the depths of the Depression, what did Roosevelt do? He created the Federal Housing Authority. He created a government agency that would guarantee to a bank that if it lent to a working class person who met certain requirements, if that working class person couldn't pay, the government would step in and make good the payments. It's the beginning of the vast production of individual homes in the United States. It created a demand for housing because suddenly working class people could get a loan. Because the government guaranteed it. So a footnote again. Why do we have a housing industry? Because the government did that. Not private enterprise. Private enterprise didn't do shit. They couldn't do it. They wouldn't do it. The government created the suburb. Because if everyone's going to have a private home, where are they going to put them? You can't do that in the city. So the ring around the city is the place where the private home, subsidized by the government, gets built. That was the only kind of credit most Americans could get. And only the upper half of the working class could qualify. You had to have a nice income, you had to have a secure job, otherwise you wouldn't get even a government subsidy. What really changed was the 1970s, and here's where the credit comes. The 1970s is when the real wages of American workers stopped rising. That is the most fundamental fact about the last 50 years of American history. It may be the most fundamental fact about all of American history. The wages stopped. The Americans who are supposed to deliver their American dream to their children, to have a nice house, a nice car, wear nice clothes, go on a nice vacation, be a nice consumer. How are you going to do that if your wages don't go up? You borrow. You created borrow. But if the wages had kept on going up, there would be no explosion of debt. There would be no need, just as there wasn't before. The explosion of debt since the 1970s is the American way of postponing the confrontation with what it means when the capitalist class no longer has to pay you rising wages. as it had to for 150 years because we had a continuous labor shortage in this country. That's why waves of immigrants came here. That's why we forced Africans to come here. That's why we had to pay higher wages, not only to get them to come here, these working people, but to get them not to run away from their industrial job to become a farmer with all that free land that we had taken away from the Indians. That's what we did. And we had to pay higher wages. That's why all the immigrants came here. In the 1970s, because of the computer, which replaced people, because of the beginning of a mass export of jobs to cheaper wages, because of women moving into the labor force, in a paid labor force in a massive way, because of more immigration, it was no longer necessary for capitalists to pay rising wages. And they jumped. They didn't pay them anymore. And the American working class was completely shocked. What? How? I promised an education to my children. I promised a car. I promised to myself, to my wife, to my husband. We could have had a nation of workers who said, okay, we're not being paid anymore, end of the consumer society, we'll just make do with what we have. Those of you that are Americans understand that is not going to happen. Moreover, it was never discussed. It was never, I won't embarrass you by asking how many of you don't know that. No one has ever told you about it. It was never discussed in America. One of the great psychological injuries done to the American people was not to explain in the 70s what had happened to the economy that ended rising wages. And why was it an injury? Because every American worker, and I mean everyone, internalized that as if it were their own personal failure. I didn't go to college. I didn't take the right courses. I haven't worked hard enough. I'm the lazy, craphead that my mother sometimes said I was. All those things. It was internalized. And that's why Americans worked more hours. Right? I told you that statistic. Americans do more paid hours of labor per year than any other working class in the world. We are exhausted physically. We are dependent on a whole lot of drugs to get us through the level of pressure and tension that we as a society have imposed or allowed to be imposed on us. So of course we borrowed money to escape. The borrowing of the last 30 years was a way to show the world, look at the car I drive. Look at the house I live in. I am the